Hey, I want to talk about how a faction in my emergent gameplay series server was able to do the impossible and beat a faction that was seemingly undefeatable. Lots of subvertive expectations here. I'm going to cut out some of the intro and the behind the scenes stuff because honestly I'll be rehashing what I mentioned in this video, links top right hand corner. It talks about how this air quotes undefeatable faction was actually somewhat of a subvertive faction itself. It started out with 20 ships that beat an alliance that had over 70 ships, and it did so decisively. In about 6 battles, this faction, known as the Khan's Enclave, not only held off a superior force, but struck deep into hostile territories while fighting essentially 2 fronts at the same time. They destroyed this HQ, thus leveling a faction, one of the old-time factions of this series. However, this is not that story. This story is about how the remaining faction of that alliance went from losing every single battle for almost 3 months straight, and in just 3 battles, essentially speaking, reversed the outcome of the war and put this previously undefeatable enemy on the back foot on the road to loss. Before getting started, I'd like to do a quick shout out. First off, those that partake in the series. I'm going to talk about, what they did, their sweats, their toils. Everyone is very passionate about their factions. I don't mean any disrespect, and I'm very proud of how people have played this out right up to the bitter end. So, thanks guys. I also want to thank my Patreons. Running this show is both expensive, both in time, commitment, and server costs. It's basically a part-time job for me or more. So the people that are willing to give me money, it means a lot to me, both monetarily and mentally. So thank you guys, means a lot. On with the show. The protagonist of this story is, as I mentioned, the Rider faction. Let's go back in time a bit because I think this further will help illustrate the staggering and impressive nature of this accomplishment. I'll be brief as mentioned. The Riders started out as easily the most behind faction. While they were in a good place when this season started, having a lot of capital ships and a lot of momentum behind them, an initial push of both the CDF and Riders into the hostile Khan territory ended up as a disaster. The Riders themselves lost 5 sub-capital ships and one of their irreplaceable capital ships. From here on out, the entire thing just seemed doomed. On top of that, after this catastrophic loss, their brand new leader and a lot of their hope stepped down, unable to really grapple with this staggering one-sided defeat. The Riders would get a new leader, and a new offensive was attempted to push the Khans back out of this space, but it only resulted in even more loss, with their battleship almost being destroyed, losing another 5 destroyers over a series of battle, and even losing their shipyard, which for this encounter, the shipyard is how you build ships in a rapid fashion. So without it, the faction was basically on life support at this point. Even looking at this with their remaining ship, there wasn't too much hope left. The Riders, at this point were by far the worst faction in basically all metrics at this point. They had, I would say, acceptable destroyer-type ships, but their capital ships were seriously behind the power curve, and their battleship, their main kind of weapon, was the laughingstock of the community, having had no successful battles this season thus far. Their individual pilot skills was also somewhat lacking, and a lot of pilots lacked basic understanding of Space Engineers combat. Now don't get me wrong, there were absolutely standout pilots from the first season, but as an aggregate, it do be like that. Their leadership style was that of a top-down approach as well. That is, it's a top-down, very singular person leadership style. Command issues orders, you follow the orders. This is in contrast to the Khans, their enemy, who use a very organic, ground-up leadership style. And, well, it brought the Khans to this point where they functionally won something like 10 battles in a row. Now, don't get me wrong, top-down leadership can work, and it does work. Both the CDF and EFN have shown it can work extremely well. But to be blunt, it requires a fast-thinking, adaptable leader that is good at what he is doing. It also requires him to function not only in the good scenarios, but in scenarios where the chips are down, the situation is stressful, and the clear answer is not always available. And when your faction is losing, that makes up the majority of scenarios. We saw this play out with the Riders' game plan time and time again. They would often have very complicated strategies. Sometimes they would have no strategy. Leaders would go silent for minutes at a time because they just didn't know what to do. They didn't have the experience or they were panicked. We would see ships just wander off and die. We would see capital ships just completely isolated from the start of the battle onward. We saw tunnel vision and more. So that brings us back to the start of this video and why this is so interesting and cool. How did the riders basically go from level 0 to the point where they were defeating the undefeatable faction? If you can see in the battle, once the CDF fell, the riders did inherit some of the CDF ships and holdings, but the statement still stands. You can have 10 squadrons, you can have 15 squadrons, you can have 1 squadron. If you don't win, you're not going to win. Yeah, I know, real deep Sun Tzu shit right there. But ultimately, how did the riders begin to win? Honestly, a lot of people thought this war was over. Once the CDF fell, the Khans would turn right back around and kill the riders. But it didn't happen. Let's go through some of the externalities real quick. One big one was the Eternity faction, or the EFN faction. A faction, one of the roaming factions in the series, penetrated deep into enemy or Khan territory and began to inflict casualties. Relatively speaking, it killed 6 frigates and 2 destroyers, which seems like a lot, but really in a war where 30 ships have been sunk and 8 of them are capital ships, this was actually a fairly minor deal. The real benefit of this is having the ship be here takes up mental and physical assets to deal with. Specifically, one of the legendary Khan battleships and cruisers was sent to deal with this problem. And while in the long run this may or may not have changed the war, it's hard to say, it most certainly made the war move closer towards its conclusion. It also obviously made sure the riders didn't have to deal with a double battleship squadron. Another major factor was Khan overextension. The Khans were very measured in their initial approach. Take a tile, consolidate, set up reserves, then move to the next. Unbeatable layered defense. However, at some point, due to their relatively small fleet size, they had to leave a stringed or thin front line to create the reserves and amount of ships required to kill a faction. Now, the gamble absolutely paid off, but right after that was approximately right around the time the riders began to go on the offensive and the EFN started really wreaking havoc at home. There were a lot of fires the Khans needed to put out after they killed the CDF, and they really began to struggle dealing with all of them in a rapid time frame. So much so that the Khans actually gave up multiple tiles, free tiles that they owned, in order to consolidate their front line. This absolutely helped give both the riders the time and area to really close in on the Khans. However, ultimately the Khans did consolidate their position. So there's more to it. Big important thing that the riders had that made them win was morale. More importantly, training and morale. If you watched the previous video, you know the CDF mental game broke. After about 5 losses, the CDF basically said it's impossible, and while they could have probably dragged out the war, the real-life CDF players just didn't have it in them anymore. They kind of just, alright, whatever, that's it. And the faction fell soon thereafter. Right? If it's not fun, it's not fun. The riders actually took the opposite attitude. Hey, not only are we still alive, not only can we still fight, but we have a lot of fight left in us. So let's put up a damn fight. But the realization and the humility quickly set in, we're not very good at this. So they started to train. At first, it was basic pilot skills. How to fly properly, how not to die randomly, how not to just run off and go do your own thing and get tunnel visioned. And this took time. This took 2 weeks, then 3 weeks, and then 1 month, and then more. However, they just kept going and going and going. But most importantly, after Malta fell, they tried an offensive move, and they got wiped. They lost another very famous, storied capital ship, and it was just a mess of a fight. But they didn't give up. They kept at it. Even when Outlands took a 1.5 month hiatus, right? We take breaks sometimes. They kept training behind the scenes. And then, when that 1.5 months ended, and it was time to fight, they started fighting, and they started winning a lot. And that leads us to the next point. Why were they winning? Well, it was leadership style, tactics, and teamwork. Here's a thing in life and in space engineers. A lot of times, there is that saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and then expecting different results. What was that video game, the Far Cry 3 or something? But a lot of people misunderstand this to mean if something doesn't work, you shouldn't try it again. That is not technically true. Doing the exact same thing over again is the issue. But some cases require you to continue working at the same problem over and over and over again. Sometimes the issue isn't that you did a thing, it's that you didn't do a thing hard enough. And the riders refused to abandon their style. And the rider style was always top-down leadership, very teamwork-centric, but ultimately still run by one person. Going into their battles, man, did they suck. Not only did they not initially have great pilots, but their leadership was very untried, untested, and did not have the experience. But it turns out, if you do something like 2.5 months worth of training straight, day after day, where the people that are needing to learn are humble and are willing to learn, where the leaders are willing to learn, and the people that know stuff are willing to give out that information, well, you can go quite far. So when the Khans finally met the riders on the battlefield, after that initial loss, after the break, they were used to a rider force that was disjointed and untrained. Let me illustrate the last 3 battles, and I think that really shows how effective a top-down leadership strategy can be if everyone is firing on all cylinders. Battle 1 started out as a stalemate. Both sides were trading blow. Opportunity arose. The rider leader had guessed that at some point a certain scenario would unfold, and that he could cut off the enemy fallback and cause an encirclement to occur. And that's exactly what happened. When a certain scenario presented itself, where he could surround a smaller force of Khan vessels, he had 2 rider destroyers with pre-programmed jump drives jump forward through the enemy, cutting them off. Now, those destroyers were in a risky spot, but those destroyer pilots knew that they were going to be in a risky spot, and they planned to just focus on dodging. Now, with the Khan forces pincered, they were able to close this, cause crippling damage to the core cruiser of this formation. Thus, the Khans had to flee and the battle was won. And this day, the riders took back their shipyard. In another hallmark battle, not soon thereafter, 4 rider destroyers went up against a Khan battleship, cruiser, destroyer, and frigate. These were pretty piss-poor odds, I'll be real. However, using a strategy that you could loosely compare to defeat in detail, they used the incredibly nimble destroyers to evasion tank the battleship. And the battleship would try to kill this destroyer, but this destroyer was not interested in dealing any damage. It was simply interested in tying down that battleship. The remaining 3 destroyers would dogpile onto a target, and due to their mobility, they were actually able to go onto this target before the cruiser can consolidate, creating a very imbalanced fight in the direction we wouldn't expect it at all. While this battle would eventually result in a defeat, because lull, battleship and cruiser against destroyers, the amount of damage inflicted was impressive. And it was so much so that this battleship formation eventually actually had to retreat due to the amount of damage they were inflicted upon against a very cheap rider squadron. One final battle. A Khan cruiser and 4 frigates, 5 ships totals, went up against 1 rider cruiser and 3 frigates. These were much lighter squadrons at the fringes, but this battle ended up being very important. While this battle is also a little more down to luck, hey, it is like that sometimes, using smart callouts, the riders were able to leverage this battle to create local superiority. For most of the fight, it looked like it was neck and neck, and that the KE might actually win. However, while there were imbalances elsewhere and frigates were falling on the rider side, there was a localized advantage for the cruisers fighting against the cruiser, and they inflicted enough damage on the cruisers such that while the Khans were still in good shape elsewhere, the heart of the formation, the cruiser, was crippled to the point where they had to retreat, and the riders won this day. And this battle ended up being very important, and that was actually that. Off of the back of 3 very specific battles, the Khan battle line was broken, supply lines were severed, and they functionally fell back to an Alamo with no ability to enact offensive moves. And in fairly short order, the Khan Empire is done for. And that was that. Thanks for watching. This is part of a series called Outlands. This was all legitimate emergent gameplay from factions that number roughly 15 active players, give or take, and then 20 plus semi-active players that kind of do a little less but support these main players. There's no such thing as roles of active versus semi-active. I'm just trying to indicate there's room for anyone at any level of commitment. So if this was interesting to you, consider joining as a viewer on our live streams, on Twitch, commenting in the YouTube comments, or joining straight up on Discord and getting in on part of the action. This season is coming to an end, but we have an exciting next season coming up real soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.